On the cold, overcast winter morning of December 4th, 1918, the USS George Washington, loaded with American dignitaries, departs Hoboken's U.S. Army Transport Services Pier 5, bound for the Paris Peace Conference. As Wilson and the rest of his delegation sailed past Battery Park and made their way through Upper New York Bay, the euphoric crowds could be seen on the shoreline. The promise of a long-awaited peace had stoked the hearts and imagination of not only the country, but the world. As the crowds watched the George Washington disappear into the open waters of the Atlantic, they were witnessing something historic, for at no other time in American history had a sitting president traveled abroad as part of an official foreign policy mission. America prior to 1916 had no foreign interests, largely pacifist or non-interventional, but would return from Paris as a preeminent world power. As the first U.S. president to set sail for foreign soil, it would prove an omen for the many more unprecedented, world-changing events to follow over the next year. And those decisions made would then set the tone for the entire 20th century, the American century. Along with Wilson came great expectations, presented by newsprint and radio as the only man in the world able to settle traditional European frustrations. Frank Polk, Lippmann, Frankfurter, and Colonel House had all been in Paris since October, and the U.S. propaganda operation had had some time to prepare for the president's arrival. He was cheered in the U.S. when he left, and welcomed in Europe with open arms when he arrived, almost as if the general public had forgotten his previous 24 months, Wilson being involved in a war to, quote, make the world safe for democracy, end quote, a striking volte-face after being re-elected in late 1916, largely on his staunch anti-war viewpoints. From disinterested pacifist to interventional warmonger and the international leader of a moral crusade in less than 100 days. Historians cite several reasons for Wilson's astonishing turnabout, but seldom do they seriously consider those around him, those with influence, those able to persuade the president of the Orwellian belief that war was the only way to peace. Bernays, Frankfurter, and Lippmann were all near the center of Wilson's inner circle. Each had his ear, and each had profound influence on Wilson's thinking beyond that of even his own administration.
Members of the inquiry to travel with Wilson to Paris, not yet mentioned, but deserving of early introduction, include the inquiry's colonial expert, the son of wealthy New York German Jews, George Louis Beer. George gained both his Bachelor of Arts in 1892 and a Master of Arts in 1893 while at Columbia University. His master's thesis was titled The Commercial Policy of England Toward the American Colonies. Beer's father, Julius, made his fortune on the London Stock Exchange and was owner of the Observer. George Louis Beer was a staunch supporter of British and American relations, writing on the subject in his most well-known work, The English-Speaking Peoples, in 1917. The entire premise of the book, an argument for a British-American Union. Beer was an American correspondent for the Round Table Journal and a historian of the Imperial School. He and Lippmann were both key secretive liaisons between the inquiry and Milner's men, those members of the British delegation who were disciples of Cecil John Rhodes, and his dream of bringing together all the English-speaking races into an Anglo-American reunion. Another key inquiry member worth recognizing is Canadian Quaker James Thomson Shotwell. Born and raised a Gladstonian progressive liberal, Shotwell received his Bachelor of Arts from Toronto University on a scholarship in 1898, and his PhD from Columbia in 1903. He completed his education by traveling to Europe to study in 1904. Shotwell paid his way through university by tutoring Latin to elite Canadian aristocrats. He believed strongly that science, technology, and innovation would create a future peaceful society. Shotwell was recruited to the inquiry through an initial phone call from Herbert Crowley, and would work within the Committee on Public Information, the propaganda arm of the American government. Shotwell is the primary author of the International Labour Organization and was professor of history and international relations at Columbia for 15 years prior to the peace conference. His closest friends were fellow Columbia faculty members, James Harvey Robinson, the new history professor and founder of the New School for Social Research, and progressive icon, the radical Charles Beard. Beard, most known for his reevaluation of the Founding Fathers and the Constitution, that led to a wide-ranging reinterpretation of early American history. All this putting Shotwell well within the intellectual socialist sphere. Both Robinson and Beard left Columbia amid great controversy.
Walter Lippmann, the young socialist radical, known today as the father of modern journalism, like Beer, was born to an affluent family in New York and lived in what his biographer called a gilded Jewish ghetto. Lippmann had an early association with the New York banking families, attending the Sachs School for Boys, and was later tapped Phi Beta Kappa at Harvard. He would write for the Harvard Crimson at 17 and learn directly from George Santayana, William James, and Graham Wallace. Lippmann was one of the earliest recruits of the inquiry. His time at the New York Public Library preparing was highly secretive, and for an iconic American journalist such as Lippmann, history finds him uncomfortably close to elite upper society, the nexus of the modern U.S. intelligence community and the Anglo-American establishment. Lippmann would travel overseas on clandestine propaganda missions during the war and during the inquiry's early months. He advocated American involvement in Europe, and like many of the inquiry members, was a large proponent of a society reliant on the expert, writing about it most famously in his seminal book, Public Opinion, published 2 years after the Treaty of Versailles, and 2 years before Edward Bernays' Crystallizing Public Opinion. Lippmann coined the terms stereotype and manufacture of consent, and continued to write on the state of American propaganda in 1925 with The Phantom Public. Lippmann would win 2 Pulitzer Prizes over a 60-year career and was a prominent member of the Round Table movement.
Charles Seymour was chief of the Austro-Hungarian division at Paris and was born in New Haven, Connecticut, home of Yale University. Seymour received his first Bachelor of Arts while studying abroad at King's College in Cambridge in 1904 and received his second BA from Yale in 1908, as well as a PhD in 1911. He was born to a family with a long history at Yale, including former presidents, membership dating back to as early as 1702. Tapped Skull and Bones and a founding member of the CFR, Seymour was a professor at Yale for 26 years before beginning his own Ivy League presidency in 1937. Seymour is related to another inquiry member, fellow bonesman, and member of the Phi Beta Kappa Society, Clive Day.
On December 10th, 6 days after departure from Hoboken, the president summoned members of the inquiry to his quarters. There, if we are to believe the accounts, we see revealed the idealist in Wilson, the president demanding a new order of things that, quote, if it won't work, it must be made to work. Agreeably if we can, disagreeably if necessary. Tell me what's right, and I'll fight for it. Give me a guaranteed position." End quote. This entire passage from Shotwell's At the Paris Peace Conference, a secondary source account, although corroborated by both Isaiah Bowman as an official memorandum and Beer in his personal diary, is of an unrecorded conversation that took place behind closed doors in the middle of the Atlantic that at first glance must be carefully considered before committing to fact. But when compared to the subsequent actions taken by Wilson and the inquiry in Paris over the next year, and when considering the evidence today through the lens of 100 years of hindsight, these statements regarding the intimate relationship between the president and the inquiry remain accurate today. As the president landed in France, it signified more than the culmination of an 18-month-long intelligence gathering exercise. As Wilson made that first step onto European soil, he was forever breaking from long-held American tradition. And with much of the world reeling from the horrors of the Great War, many were already anticipating, expecting even, a new world order. Much of the American public were sold on the benefits of an international peace brought about by social justice, but failed to recognize the inherent conflict between the U.S. Constitution and this Wilsonian New World community. It was well known by all those most involved long before Paris that the U.S. Constitution would be their biggest hurdle to world peace. If they were to deliver a new collectivism, the American Constitution had to be subverted and replaced by a supranational. The individual was to be dispossessed of his traditional American aloofness towards European conflict by an international moral obligation. The inquiry was to drive home the foundation to a scientific, technologically driven approach to human governance through one giant international. It was the progressive movement writ large. So join us next time as Wilson makes a break for Versailles. His closest advisors, House, Frankfurter, Lippmann, and the father of propaganda, Edward Bernays, have already been in town for months, and with the Muckrakers hanging in the shadows, and the director of the Committee on Public Information, George Creel, just now arriving alongside the president, the Paris Peace Conference of 1919 may have been the most significant moment ever in the history of propaganda.